Hey there booktube, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to tell you about all the books that I read in September and October. It's not that many. In September I only read 3 books. I started 3 books, I didn't even finish 3 books. I was reading the Decameron in September. You'll remember I made videos every day about this giant book, so it was one of the books that I started in September but didn't quite finish until October. But I'm going to tell you about all the books that I read in order. So I started with this one, Carla Negger's Thief's Mark. I got this one from the publisher in order to do a review, and I read it, I reviewed it. I didn't love this book, but there were things about it that I enjoyed reading. It was about a boy who was there when his parents were killed. He was a child, and the 2 suspects who were accused of killing his parents, they disappeared. And decades later, he's now an adult, and one of the suspects turns upon his door and dies right in front of him. Of course, he's suspected as being the killer of this guy, and so he goes on the run. And the story is following the unraveling of both of those murders, which I guess everybody assumes is going to be linked. What I didn't know when I started to read this book is that it was a part of a series. So there was a lot of explanation of backstory and relationships, but the author did a good job of making this a standalone novel, so I did still understand who the people were, even if I didn't know everything that was happening in their lives prior to this book starting. I reviewed it completely on my blog, so I'll link my blog posts down below if you want to check out more about it. So that's The Thief's Mark. I started off with that one. I read In the Country by Mia Alvar. This is a collection of short stories that follow Filipino characters, most of whom are living in other countries. I did a buddy read of this one with K.A., who's a subscriber on my channel, and it was a really insightful experience to share reading this book with her. This was our first buddy read. We've since gone on to read something else, and we have plans to continue buddy reading, so it's really interesting. I mean, it's great to talk about the book when I'm done reading it with all of you, but it's also good to share thoughts about each story as we read them. So that made the reading of this book even better than it probably would have been if I was just reading it. The stories themselves were very interesting. Some of them were better than others. Most of them are pretty long. It's over 300 pages, and there are 9 stories. So some of the stories were quite lengthy, but also very enjoyable. We got to learn Filipino history, as well as to see how immigrants live in other parts of the world. So they weren't just immigrants in the United States, although there is a story that takes place in New York at the time of the World Trade Center attacks that was really well written. But their stories, their characters who are living in the Middle East, women whose husbands have gotten contracts in the oil fields, and so on. So this was a really, really beautifully written story, and I would love to read a novel from this author. Like I said, most of the stories were pretty long, so I feel like she could probably write a full-length novel and hold my interest. So I'm looking forward to seeing something else by her. And then I started to read The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. This is a translation by Wayne Rebhorn, and it is also the translation that has the blurb from one of BookTube's greats, Steve Donahue. It's right here. And I'll tell you what Steve Donahue's blurb says. Wayne Rebhorn's excellent new Decameron captures the coruscating mood shifts of Boccaccio with more contemporary feeling gusto than any English language translation has yet managed. This is a Decameron at once elegant and effusive, as varied in its tones and moods as the original. Steve Donahue, Quarterly Conversation. This was a really, really great idea to read this book. Kudos to Adam from Memento Mori, who suggested this read along in September. The idea was to read as much of the book as possible during September, to try to finish it in a month. If I'd stuck to the schedule, I would have been able to, but I had a lot of other stuff going on in September. I mean, September is my birthday month. I was celebrating all month, okay? But no, I started reading this, but I didn't finish. Somewhere along the line, I decided to draw my experience reading this book, so you'll know that I have 8 days of sketches in this book. The days meaning that this book is divided into 10 days. It takes place in Italy around the time of the mid-1300s, around the time of the Black Plague, and it follows 10 characters, 7 young women and 3 young men who decide to escape the Black Plague and all the terror and death that is associated with it, and they go into the countryside and hole up in this abandoned palace for some time. And while they're there, they're telling each other stories. So they're there for 10 days, 100 stories. And while I was reading this book, on day 3, I started to sketch what was happening in each one of the stories. So I sketched about 80 stories, and that was a fantastic experience. If you haven't watched those videos, go ahead and watch them, especially the last 2. I loved it. It was a really great experience. I finished in October, which is kind of why I didn't do a September recap. But this was one of the books that made me feel most accomplished reading it during this year, because it was a book that I'd never picked up before. It's a giant size. It's over 900 pages, and I absolutely loved it. So that was my September into October reading recap. Now for all the books that I read throughout October. After the Decameron was over, I started to read Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, and I was reading this book when the Booker Prize was announced, and this is the book that won the Booker, so I was really happy to be reading it at the time when it was announced. I think I might have finished it the day before. I also got this copy as a gift a couple of days before, and after the Booker was announced, my friend called me and said, "Oh man, look, you should have waited to get the book, because now it doesn't have the Booker winner sticker on it." But that's okay. That's okay. At least that's what I'm telling myself for right now. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln's son, Willie, dying while Lincoln is president. So he dies in the White House, and his body is taken to the crypt for burial. But Willie doesn't realize that he is dead. He is clinging on to this world. And so while he is there, his spirit is not able to move on. And so the story is about his experience in the Bardo, which is what the Catholics probably refer to as purgatory, that state between life and the rest of death. So this period where the soul has not yet found rest and is trying to right wrongs that were done in life, or try to understand why death has come, or this period has come. So the characters in the Bardo are ghosts. They're all people who are clinging to this side of life, even though they're no longer able to enter life. Of course, I don't subscribe to the spiritual belief that Saunders talks about in this book, but I don't think most readers do. But as literature, I think that this is a fascinating example of literature and fully deserving of the prize. And so this is the first book that I started and finished in October. Next, I read Alice Smith's Autumn, which is another book that was nominated for the Booker Prize, and the book that I probably think might have won, if not for George Saunders' submission. This one is about an older man and a young woman who have a relationship. No, not that kind of a relationship. They meet when she's a child and he moves in next door. And her mother kind of uses him as an unpaid babysitter, and this old man has conversations with this young girl, and he teaches her about life and about art and about literature. And the relationship grows and blooms, and when he is much older and he's confined to bed, she goes to visit him and she reads to him. And so in the process of them spending time together, you learn about him, you learn about her, you learn about the conversations that she remembers and why they are significant. I don't understand all of the cultural references in this book because I don't follow European politics as much as I probably should. So there are references to recent developments in the United Kingdom, like the Brexit, which they say this book talks about a lot. But I didn't really read it much from that perspective because I'm not familiar enough with that story. So this is a book that I want to reread. Eric from Lonesome Reader has promised to do a discussion on the cultural references in this book, and I'm probably going to wait until he does that in order to go back through this book. She has a follow-up which is called Winter, which I'm really looking forward to reading as well. After that, I read The Lauras by Sarah Taylor. I got this one from the publisher in order to do a review. This one's about 13-year-old Alex, who in the middle of the night, Alex's parents are having a fight, just a regular fight like they always do, except this time Alex's mother, who we call Ma, takes Alex and they leave the house, just maybe, you know, to go to the corner to blow off some steam, have a slice of cake at the diner, except they don't come back. They're living in Virginia. They drive all the way to Florida, and then from Florida they move to the West Coast, to California, and eventually to Vancouver. And so starts this road trip on which Alex learns a lot about Alex, but also learns a lot about Ma. There were a lot of things that I really enjoyed about this book, so we'll talk about them when we get to a closer book. After that, I read 2 fantasy books, which, you know, fantasy is not my genre, but I had to read them because I was doing a challenge, a reading challenge that ended in October. And so I had 10 books to read between the period of July and October. And the last 2 that I read, and I read them in the last couple of days in October because I wasn't looking forward to either one of them. First is Heartless by Marissa Mayer. And this is an adaptation of the Queen of Hearts story. And in this one, we're following this young woman named Catherine. She's a daughter of a marquis, and her mother has her primed to become the next queen, to marry the king. But Catherine has no desire to marry the king. Number one, because the king she thinks is stupid, but also because she wants more from her life. She wants to become a baker. She's excellent at baking, and she knows that if she becomes queen, she won't be able to bake. So they have a party, and at the party she meets the Joker, and she falls in love with the Joker, who has another reason that he is there. And so the book is about their experience, whether or not she will marry the king and become the queen, or whether she will fall for the Joker. I mean, fall for the Joker, really? That's so cliche. Or whether she will just, you know, not get married and fulfill her desire to become an entrepreneur. So I like things about the book. I like the wordplay that the author used. A lot of puns that refer to this book as well as to other examples of really great literature. She makes this, she incorporates the Raven, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, into the story, and I thought that was really well done. But this is not my favorite genre. Fantasy, young adult fantasy, fairy tale retelling is really not my thing. But overall, I enjoyed the fact that I read it. I was glad that I was done. So then I was ready to move on to the last book of October, my last fantasy book. And this one is weird because I actually bought this book. I bought this book earlier this year. I bought it for the cover. I didn't know anything about the book. I saw B from Books with B read this book, and she raved about it and said, well, you know, I'll check it out. I saw it, I love the cover. I picked it up early this year, and you know, one of the challenges I'm doing this year is to read more of the books that I own. Books that I've bought this year, I want to read them before the end of the year. That's not going to happen. But this one, I picked it because it fulfilled the challenge of reading a book that has a non-human main character. And this one is literally following bees. The main character is Flora 717. She is a bee recently hatched, and she has a deformity, which means that she should be killed on instant, but they spare her because she has talents. Like, she could speak as opposed to others of her kind. Because of her deformity and her extraordinary ability, she's able to do things and go places within the bee colony that other bees would not be able to do. And so she learns things, and she has this unique opportunity to meet the queen. And so as she's living and going through those experiences, you get to see the inner workings of the bee colony. But overall, I was glad that I read it. Another book from my shelf read, and I finished my reading challenge. That was great. And so that is October. That is my September and October reading. I read 8 books in that period. In September, I read 1,626 pages because I am counting the entire Decameron. I'm counting all of the pages in the Decameron to September, just to kind of bump up that number. So 3 books in September, all fiction. In October, I read 5 books, and that was about 1,690 pages, and it's these 5 books. In September, 1 book came from the library, the other 2 came from my shelves. In October, 2 books came from the library, the other 3 came from my shelves. And I didn't read any nonfiction. I didn't read any nonfiction in September or October, which is why I'm really glad for Nonfiction November, because I've started some nonfiction already. So Nonfiction November is on the plans because I really need to bump up my nonfiction reading. My plan was to read kind of evenly during the year. That hasn't happened. That is far from happening. I didn't give any book 5-star ratings. Lincoln and the Bardo was probably the closest, but there were things that I didn't love about it, so I gave it a 4. And everything else, everything was between a 3 and a 4-star. I didn't hate anything, and I didn't absolutely love everything about any book. So that was September and October. At the end of October, I was at 93 books read, which means I have 9 books to meet my 2017 reading goals in terms of number, not necessarily in terms of split. Thanks for watching this video. Leave me a comment down below if you've read any of these books, you want to talk about them, or tell me what you're reading in November, what you're most looking forward to, and we'll chat down there. So until next time, happy reading. Bye.